Well, we're going to discuss the Presocratics right now and look at the nature and roots of philosophy. Um, we've reached the age of the mythical gods of the Greek pantheon. Maybe you remember the name Homer, that great poet who immortalized these gods in his epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are texts that were venerated almost as scripture by the Greeks. Homer lived in the 8th century, about the time of Isaiah and Micah, Jonah, Amos, and Hosea. And while these works as literature were held as and remain classics of the Western canon, their mythology is another question. I mean, it raises some questions about the nature of religion among the Greeks. Thinking people were not ultimately persuaded by mythology, um, the goal of which was to give meaning in an inhospitable world. And so these thinking people became the earliest philosophers. Philosophy became aware of the need to detach itself from superstition, and how they emancipated themselves from the religious was that they turned away from the mythical and they began to concern themselves with the question of origins of the world. They devoted themselves to a systematic process of observation of the world as it is. And so emerged the first philosophers, what we call the pre Socratics. Now, as a chronological reference, the term is a bit of a misnomer since some of the so called pre Socratics were also Socrates' contemporaries. But it's still a helpful title because it designates a group of Greek thinkers in the 6th and 5th centuries BC who were intellectually concerned with issues of natural philosophy and speculation about the nature of the universe. Um, and of course, they were in the mix before Socrates upset the apple cart by turning away from that to more practical and more ethical questions. So, the heart of pre Socratic thought was cosmogony and the nature of the universe. They took a more naturalistic tone than the priests and prophets of the mythical world. That is, they didn't claim to offer a revelation, but they claimed to propose insights from natural processes of reasoning. The pre-Socratics practiced this scientific approach, and they did so against the background of metaphysical questions. So, what is the fundamental nature of the universe? And by rigorous observation, they asked, what is elementary? What is fundamental? What is the world made of? Not where did the world come from? Often, in the popular mind, these pre Socratics are sometimes painted as being a little bit ridiculous. Well, they said the universe is made of air or the universe is made of water. The pre Socratics, we have to remember, proposed some very big picture ideas about the natural world, ideas that we also tend to accept as true, even if for different reasons than the ones that they proposed. For example, Democritus from 460 to 370 BC and other early atomists argued that all things are comprised of tiny particles that they called atoms. Well, that's pretty fundamental to contemporary chemistry, isn't it? And Anaximenes, active from were born in 585 and died in 525 BC, argued that in the course of its history, the Earth underwent a process of evolution. Now, I know we may think it's crazy when we read about Thales, 626 to 545 BC, who thought that the first element was water. But when you stop to think about how he reasoned his way back to that. He claimed that everything originates in water and everything ultimately dissolves into water. It follows then that all things originate from water as their fundamental principle, since all animals' seeds are moist. So Thales believed that the earth floats, and it floats on water because water is the eternal substance. According to Thales' logic, since Earth is a modification of water, it must be a lighter substance because floating islands seem to occur. On the other hand, according to Anaximenes, it was the air. Everything was air, and he believed in degrees of condensation of moisture that corresponded to the densities of various types of matter. Uh, when most evenly distributed, air is the common invisible air that we know in the atmosphere. But by condensation, it becomes visible first as mist or a cloud, then as water, and finally, if it condenses even more, it becomes solid matter, such as earth or stones. On the other hand, if it rarefies, if it becomes less and less dense, then it becomes fire. And so hotness and dryness typify rarity, whereas coldness and wetness are related to denser matter. Anaximander, from 611 to 546 BC, thought that all of creation comes from something indeterminate and limitless. Heraclitus, from 540 to 480 BC, claimed that everything is always in motion, and so you can't take a step into the same river twice because the river is constantly changing. While Parmenides, active around 515, believed that nothing ever changed. It just seemed that it was. Well, these kinds of approaches, based on the powers of observation that these philosophers could give to ask questions about the very nature of the universe, and what is the world made of, these questions result really in a big step forward. Rather than proposing supernatural and mythical origins, the Presocratics believed in an underlying order of the universe. And by very close observation, they sought to propose a rational argument about the origins of the material world. Beyond the question of where we come from, the more fundamental question is, what is being? And this leads us to those big words like ontology or metaphysics. But this question invites us to think about the first being, the source of all things. And so I want to take a little detour to sort of have a short history of the Greek word theos, the word that means God. The Greek concept was essentially a polytheistic idea in the sense of belief in an ordered totality of gods. Zeus, as the father of gods and men, brings this to expression. I mean, Zeus had the first and the last word and is sometimes called theos, God. But out of the plurality, a hierarchy develops with families of gods and a pantheon. Zeus, Apollo, etc., are all called gods, and so is the cosmos at times. And the elemental forces may also be given the name theos from time to time. Though eternal, the gods have somehow come into being. They are not. They have not created the world, but they are its form or its meaning. They are thus identified with human order, for instance, in the state, the polis, the society. Their eternity includes eternal youth. They enjoy superior power and felicity, but they lack moral seriousness. They are infinite beings, but of the same kind as ourselves. Unlike impersonal fate, which even they cannot alter, they do represent meaningful plan and purpose. And so the Presocratics subject the Homeric gods of myth to rational criticism, replacing anthropomorphism with cosmomorphism. The presence of divinity in the world is not denied by the Presocratics, but its unity is stressed. And the idea of the unmoved mover is introduced. Their consistency of being and the principle of compensation of cosmic justice represents an ethical aspect to pre-Socratic thought. But Xenophanes, 560 to 478 BC, ridiculed the ancient Greek gods of Olympus. He went on to argue for a single, motionless, non anthropomorphic, a non human kind of a god who controlled everything by the power of thought. Xenophanes retained that Greek word theos, the word that we've used for these Homeric gods with personalities and powers. He retained that same word theos, but he radically revised its meaning, enabling it to continue to perform a religious role of being the personal center of a meaningful world. This was the method followed by the later Greek philosophers. All of them replaced the plurality of gods, the pantheon, as a class of superhuman beings with the use of theos in the singular. And they mean different things by it. The term tended to be treated as a proper noun or a personal name in the way that one might have used Zeus or Pluto as personal names. But this is not what the philosophers intended. Plato, for instance, carries the ethical side and the spiritual side further by denying divine intervention in the form of a physical relationship, as though somehow we could pray and God intervenes as an answer to our prayers. He wants to separate deity and humanity, and so he postulates only a resemblance of being and no true unity between humanity and God. Humans are like the divine in some way, but they're not really related to it. Instead, a Plato myth serves only to elucidate philosophical and ethical themes. Ultimate reality is impersonal, and divinity means the actualization in space and time as a moving reflection of eternity. And so, in that way, the deity, as if you will, in Plato, sort of plays the role of an architect, not a creator. We'll come to that in our next session. In Aristotle, too, deity is the necessary condition of world order, the prime mover, the cause of each thing existing as it does. One doesn't pray to this deity, nor does it will anything. And if there's love for it, well, this is just the attraction which impels us to strive for a higher form of being. So I want to read you this quote that, well, to me, captures the distinction between philosophy and religion, between philosophers and priests, between science and myth. Obviously, while one seeks and demonstrates, the other confesses, worships, or prays. Here, the first distinctions are made between the truths of faith and those of reason. Thus, the philosopher has emancipated himself from the sacred dimension of myth. He has desacralized thought by detaching himself from the hold of the religious. He distinguished between what is of the order of faith and what is of the domain of reason. But how do we reconcile reason and discourse on God? Well, that's a question that we're going to have to pursue just a little bit further. And so we'll come back in the next session to talk about truth and myth